ultimately composition, there's no right or wrong answer. Like even me, I like to study etymology to kind of get to the root of the words. And that doesn't mean that there's an ultimate truth. To me, I think good composition, it's kind of fun, interesting, dynamic, powerful, and kind of fun. So I Wiktionaried this, and then like according to Wiktionary, it means composition means compositio, which means with position. And so these are just some general definitions I found. And it's kind of interesting because when we talk about composition, it's not just, photography composition. It's like, there's different fields in which we use the term composition, right? So even back in the day, like they would say a person's personality or the temperament or how they're feeling is like, oh, how is your composition? Or back in the day, composition was like a sum of money that you would give to reach a settlement, or also like in music, right? There's musical compositions. And what is that class that everyone had to do in like elementary, middle school, high school that no one really liked?
English composition.
English composition. No one liked that class, right? It's like, yo, I already know how to speak English. Why am I taking a class on English? So if you guys all take a look at the picture on the right side. So this photograph, actually, I shot it. So this is actually one of the benefits of having a full-time job and just going out and shooting photos. Like at the time, I just graduated from college. I was like 22, and I was working for like a tech startup, and I was in Santa Monica. And like what I would actually do is like I would just milk my employer for all they were worth and try to do the minimum amount of work necessary not to get fired. And just after work or during my lunch break, I would just go out and shoot photos, which I actually find is quite a good life strategy. But anyways, so this is a photograph I shot just around the block of my workplace. I saw the background of the scene. I essentially just waited for somebody to enter the frame. And so this one technique, Henri Cartier-Bresson and photographers often do this. This is called the fishing technique. You set up your composition and just wait for the fish to get in. So if you look at the photo on the right side, what are the compositional techniques you find interesting, or the lines or the shapes or the forms?
I like the arrow.
The arrow?
I like there's like a play between symmetry and asymmetry, so that you've got certain elements of the frame are symmetrical, or sort of mirror images of each other, but then it's not in other ways. The lines are not symmetrical.
So
maybe they're it's sort of just all like that centered bauble thing is not. I don't know. Yeah,
I also like the arrow that is pointing towards the person that is in the center.
Okay, so this is kind of a fun thing I like to do too. So if you think about composition, okay, so to keep it super simple, right? I typically think that if you want to make a very strong, solid composition, you don't actually need more than one subject. You could just have one person. And what I typically like to do when I think about my compositions is I just try to keep it as simple as possible. And the irony is actually, when people tend to overcomplicate compositions, it's actually not good, where people tend to overanalyze them and stuff like that. I think a good composition, it could be good and simple. So this is one thing I like to think about when it comes to composition is like, essentially the question is, where do you put your subject? So for example, if we're looking at this picture, right? So that's my subject, right? Mm-hmm. So I have options. I could either put him here. So would that be as effective?
No.
Why not?
I don't feel him as the center of it all.
I think also because the arrow's pointing to the bike.
Yeah.
And he's also kind of framed between the lights.
Yeah.
So he kind of fits better there, but not, even though you were fishing, it doesn't seem so on purpose.
Okay, I have a question, Aaron. What if the arrow was there?
No.
Why not?
I don't know. Just aesthetically, it doesn't work for my brain. I can't put it into words.
I mean, I like that.
That might be because of the top part of it, right? There's symmetry there.
Yeah.
I would sort of expect something to be in the middle of the line.
Because maybe
But now it's all shifted. It just feels like doesn't feel like a keeper anymore.
Well, I also feel like I don't know the story anymore. I see him going off somewhere where before he was part of a journey and I was part of it with him.
So Patrick, what if he was here?
If he was there and the arrow was closer to him, I would still feel like he's part of this, like he matters.
How about if that?
But not as much as the center.
How about this?
I think it's just that there's like too much weight in the center of the photograph. That if you have like another subject competing with the ornament in the middle, like it just kind of, it's like a little bit like disunified, like it can't really tell what is trying to grab at my attention.
Maybe I read some of your emails, Eric. Maybe it's the triangles.
Ooh, Aaron, good. A++. Where do you see the triangles?
Wow.
A++. Where do you see the triangles?
Like you can almost draw a triangle from the bike, like up to the left.
To here?
Exactly. And then back down.
And then back down here?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then the same on the other side.
Oh. All right, what else do y'all see?
I think the person in the bike itself is a small triangle.
Ooh.
On its own.
So the bike itself could be a small triangle. Astute observation, senor. So we could turn this into a small little triangle. What else? What else do y'all see?
The top of the picture or the metal balls, that you can see a triangle there.
Where do you see it?
Yeah. The shadow.
Yeah, the shadow up and down.
So you essentially see what we're doing here together. This is kind of something that I like to do for fun, because essentially, like, it's kind of a fun way for us to just kind of like analyze our images in much more interesting ways. And actually, this is something that I find very, very interesting for myself too, is that when it comes to looking at my pictures, I mean, before I did photography, I liked as a kid, I liked to draw and paint. And, I just like to use crayons or whatever. And the funny thing is, as a kid, before you learn all these rules, I think most kids actually have a pretty good intuition for composition. And I think the secret of good composition is that there needs to be dynamism and force, but some sort of kind of elegant balance behind it all too. And so, like, you could either do this in Photoshop or you could just do this on a piece of paper. But I like to do it in Photoshop because it just makes things a little bit more interesting. So essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to essentialize the composition to the purest form of the shapes and stuff like that. And it becomes very interesting, because then you could hide certain parts of the composition in the frame. You're like, oh, okay, does it still work or not? And so this is like one thing that I would like to bring up, is that I call this like visual stress testing. Do you guys know what stress testing is?
When you go to the doctor and you have to do those step tests to test your heart.
Oh, okay. How about from an engineering perspective?
Oh, well, it's basically putting load on something until it breaks.
Yeah. So
same thing, basically.
Yeah. So kind of to June's point. June, did you study engineering?
Well, science, but close enough.
All right. So this is also another thing I wanted to think too, is that like science plus art is certainly the best combination, because like this is my theory, is that the cross-pollination, the more I think about this notion, I love it. Cross-pollination. The gist is you could take what we consider disparate forms of whatever. So we tend to think that science and art are antagonists, but if you look at Da Vinci, we knew that he kind of combined both masterfully. So for those of you guys who like to, nerd out on a computer, I think it's so cool what we can do with photography, because photography is an art form, and we could get you to use all the toys and the tools to do it. And so thinking about these engineering scientific notions are good. So like, you know, even June being an engineer, you know, he's essentially like a visual engineer and could put together certain ideas. And so I want to show you guys some fun techniques we could do. So one of them is called Gaussian Blur. And essentially there was like a German scientist, his name was Mr. Gauss or something. And essentially it's just like a blurring tool that you use from Photoshop, you could do in Procreate and other tools and stuff like that. And this is one of the secret recipes I discovered just through pure experimentation, is that you're trying to stress test your images by essentially you're trying to break apart your composition as much as humanly possible before it doesn't become an image anymore. And so what I do is I apply a Gaussian blur to my photo, then I inverse it, then I add contrast and I inverse it again. And then you could keep doing this process over and over again. It's like kind of an iterative process. And to me, this is very interesting because you start to see images differently, because as photographers, we're not just photographers, we're also visual artists, which mean we love artwork and we like to make artwork. And any tool that you use to see deeper is kind of an interesting one. So in Photoshop, and don't worry, I'll send you a recording of this video after the fact. So this is where it's in the menu, and you know, you could just play with the different radiuses. And so this original image, applying with a Gaussian blur, kind of looks like that, right? And essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a general gist of the darkness or the brightness of the image. And so just to show you how I did this in Photoshop. So let's say we take the image and go to blur, Gaussian blur. And essentially, this is what I always find very interesting. You start off with the maximum blur, and then you just keep working your way left until you could see what you consider an image. So for me, it's like maybe about here. And so with what I could just like generally see in a very general sense, I could see some sort of shape and form, you know, here. And I could also see another shape and form about here. And the way that I could kind of break it down and analyze it is, this is what I generally see. I see all these arrows on the right pulling your attention, your force and energy to the right side. And on the left side, you have the antagonist image in the background pulling your eyes to the left. And I kind of like this notion of dynamic tension because, so just imagine, okay, everyone lift up your virtual hands, right? Imagine like you're holding a spring, right? Like a very strong spring. And if you pull it in opposite directions, right? As far as you can, and then you let go of the spring, what happens?
It snaps to center.
Mm-hmm. And so dynamic tension is very interesting because even if you watch a movie, right? You know, there's some sort of like sexual tension between the guy and the girl or whatever. And so typically, I think what makes a good composition or whatever is there needs to be a little bit like kind of like tension in the frame. So typically when I look at my photographs, this is also another tip too, is look at where the eyes are going. So these eyes look like they're kind of going this way, and his eyes and his nose are kind of going this way. And therefore, as a consequence, my general visual gist is, you know, something like that. That's kind of like the vibes I get. And what I did before our workshop was I prepared some materials. And if you guys have Photoshop or whatever, I'll send you guys all these materials after the workshop so you can just kind of play with the layers. And so essentially what I do is, the way I do it is in Photoshop. So this is, once again, I'll just create a new layer. And what I'll do is I'll just choose like a random color. Let's say I just choose the color red. And in Photoshop, there's this thing called the Polygonal Lasso tool, which I typically use. So I just click that. And I just draw a very general gist of what I see. And the key is you don't want to make it specific. You just want to make it super duper general. and I just right click, click fill foreground color there, and I'll create another layer. And let's say I'll just choose the color yellow. And then on the other side, I just try to draw the general gist, because I think the biggest problem is, I think with good compositions, you actually don't need that much detail. If you just kind of keep things simple, they tend to make effective compositions. And then what you could just do is, you could just make this composition, you could just make this black, and you could kind of get it just, okay, you kind of have this arrow on the right side going right, and you have this thing going here on the left. And the way that I analyzed it and broke it down was kind of like, these are the shapes I made, and just kind of clicking through it, you could just essentially get a sense that these photos are just like being drawn to the right and left side. So I kind of have this